Okay, I think we're ready to begin. So first and foremost, I want to welcome everybody back for our third lecture in this masterclass series that we're hosting for you. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and we're so happy to have you all back. And I'm very happy to welcome you today to Daily Life in the Warsaw Ghetto, which is being presented by a colleague and a friend of mine, Yael Eaglstein, who has been in Yad Vashem for 16 years. She began in the department where she worked with Israeli and then European educators. And then 4.5 years ago, she moved over to be the educational coordinator for the Gandel Holocaust Studies Program for Australian educators. So we are very pleased to have her here with us today. She is going to be asking you one question in the beginning of the program. That's what she shared with me, and she's asking you to answer in the chat. And then the rest of the questions we will hold until the end of the program, just like we've been doing so far. And as always, you can always ask questions in the chat as the lecture is taking place. Okay, so I welcome you all, and I will stop my share, and Yael's going to come on with her program.
Okay. Our topic today is everyday life in the Warsaw Ghetto. And just a minute, before we start, why isn't this? Okay, before we start, I want to ask you, what is a ghetto, what you know about ghettos? If you can write that in the chat, and Laurie will help me with what you're writing. I'll give that about 10 seconds.
Okay, so what we have here so far, I'm muted. Can you hear me? Yeah. A place where Jews are forced to live, enforced restrictions. Another where Jews were forced to live, they were confined. I think gated community. A walled section within city for Jews to live. Okay, so that's most of a closed off area of the community. So those are the answers.
Okay. So I'll say a few more, obviously, about ghettos, specifically about the Warsaw Ghetto. But you can see here the map of Poland. Central Poland was what was called Generalgouvernement. Many of the ghettos were there. We're talking about over 1,000 ghettos, which the largest one was the Warsaw Ghetto. You see it over here. And we actually have a lot of information about the ghetto, and this is part of the information is what we want to learn and hear about today. You can see that Lodz, which was the second largest ghetto, I had my late grandfather was from Lodz, was in an area that was supposed to be clean of Jews because this area was annexed by Germany. But for various reasons, it stayed until the end of the war. We're not going to go into that. But the two largest ghettos was the Warsaw Ghetto and the Lodz Ghetto. And today we're going to go into the Warsaw Ghetto. Okay. So as I mentioned, it was the largest ghetto. The people who were sent into the ghetto, there were 375,000 Jews from the city of Warsaw who were sent into the ghetto. It's pretty amazing, but before the Holocaust, every third person was Jewish, so you can imagine how rich, in terms of cultural richness, that existed in the community there. I know that many people, that's what I heard when I used to guide quite often in the museum. You know, the museum is closed at the moment. But when you guide groups, you hear about all the Jews were ultra-Orthodox, they were all religious, they were all poor, which is far from the truth. We're talking about a very different kind of Jews living there in terms of religious, in terms of school systems, youth movement system, newspapers, and so on. And those 375,000 Jews who were living in the city were sent into the ghetto, including refugees from the periphery. So when we say the largest, we're talking about numbers. There were about 450,000 Jews in an area that was less than 2.4% out of the city's land, which meant that it was overpopulated. There wasn't enough housing. There wasn't at some point enough food. We're going to talk today a lot about hunger in the Warsaw Ghetto, which was one of the big issues there. If you can please mute your microphones. In the different history books, you'll see up to 500,000 Jews. A lot was going on because of that in the ghetto. In one apartment, you can have 5, 6, 7 families, again, depending how big the apartment was, depending how big the family was. And you had different people living together in a very, very small area. I'll skip to the end and then go back to the beginning. In July 1942, the deportation began to Treblinka death camp. And the end of the story, or end of the Warsaw Ghetto, was in May 1943, after the uprising. The uprising was something that took for about a month. It was a big thing. It was a big discussion if to have or not to have Jews fighting in the ghetto against the Germans. The questions were around a lot. What are our chances? We're fighting a big army. We're weak. We don't have the same ability that the Germans had. But the decision in the end was to fight, because it was a message to themselves, to the other ghettos, and eventually also to the world. One of the reasons we have a ton of information about the Warsaw Ghetto is because the famous Oyneg Shabbos archive, it was a secret archive that was established by Dr. Emanuel Ringenblum, who was an historian before the Holocaust, who was into research before the Holocaust. He worked in the, whoever heard about that archive. And one of the extraordinary things about the ghetto is that archive, and because of that, the information that we have and that we can learn about the Warsaw Ghetto. I want to show you a short movie about the Oyneg Shabbos archive and about Emanuel Ringenblum. I want to just point out that our Yad Vashem website has many short
I'll tell you it's going to work.
Including the one I'm showing you now. So if you're interested and want to get more information about it, then it's called the Video Toolbox, and that's where I took this film at the moment. So please.
For the past 3.5 years of the war, an archive was established in the ghetto by the Oyneg Shabbos group. This curious name stems from the fact that the group convened on Saturdays, and for reasons of secrecy, the entire institution was called Oyneg Shabbos. I began collecting material on contemporary times back in October 1939, when, as head of the Jewish Self-Help Society, I was in direct daily contact with life in the surroundings. I was receiving news of what was happening to the Jews in Warsaw and its suburbs. In the evenings, I noted everything I had heard during the day and added my own comments. The war produced rapid changes in Jewish life in the towns of Poland. Each day was different from the next. It was therefore important to capture every event in the heat of the moment, when it was still fresh and pulsating. A rich community life began to develop in Warsaw with readings, lectures, memorial meetings, and concerts, all of which broadened and deepened the Oyneg Shabbos work. Despite the broad dimensions of our work, the need for secrecy inevitably restricted its scope.
I consider it a sacred duty for everyone to write down everything he has seen or heard from others about what the Germans have done. It must all be recorded without a single fact left out. And when the time comes, as it surely will, let the world read and know what the murderers have done. When the mourners write, this will be their most important material.
In May 1940, I thought it expedient to organize this highly important work as a group undertaking. Not only adults, but also young people and, in some instances, even children worked for Oyneg Shabbos. Our aim was a presentation of a photographically true and detailed picture of what the Jewish population had to experience, to think, and to suffer. The Saturday the ghetto was introduced, the 16th of November, was terrible. People in the street didn't know it was to be a closed ghetto, so it came like a thunderbolt. Details of German, Polish, and Jewish guards stood at every corner searching passers-by to decide whether or not they had the right to pass.
I entered. I crossed the boundary, not just of a residential quarter, but of a zone of reality. Because what I saw and experienced cannot be understood by our reason, thoughts, or imagination.
As I write these lines, more streets being taken away, less room, a tighter noose around our neck. Will we be able to save the Jewish child?
The world's turning upside down. A planet melts in tears. And I am hungry. Hungry. I'm hungry.
So much material was collected that we all thought the time was ripe for a summary of the various problems and prominent phenomena in Jewish life. We colloquially termed this plan 2.5 years. Many writers were already at an advanced stage of work when a new disaster descended on Warsaw Jewry. The deportation began on July 22, 1942. It marks a new period in the history of Warsaw Jewry, affecting also the nature of the Oyneg Shabbos work. There was an interruption of several months in our activities. At a time when every second threatened capture and transport to Treblinka, there could be no thought of systematic collection. Only a handful of people continued to keep diaries and to record their daily experiences, even during the deportations.
A Jew has returned to our workshop who worked as a gravedigger in Treblinka for 9 or 11 days before escaping in a train wagon. According to what he said, not only Jews from Warsaw are being exterminated in Treblinka, but Jews from all over Europe. In our courtyard, Jews are praying, pouring out their cares to the Creator.
I have been charged with the role of guardian of the access gate. I hid the material. Only I knew. I told only my friend Hirschwasser, who is my superior, where the place is. It is well hidden. I do not ask for any thanks. Only to be remembered is what I wish, so that my people, my brothers and sisters overseas, should know where my bones have been taken to.
Dear friends, we are writing to you at a time when 95% of the Jews of Poland have already perished in gruesome sufferings in the gas chambers of the slaughterhouses of Treblinka, of Sobibor, of Chełmno, and Auschwitz, or were murdered in the countless liquidation actions in ghettos and camps. Perhaps some minuscule handful of Jews might survive, those who live still illegally in constant danger. Will any of us see the end of the war? We doubt it. We would therefore like to tell you as briefly as possible of our work and activities. The intensive efforts of our staff resulted in the accumulation of more than 10 crates of particularly valuable documents, chronicles, diaries, photographs, etc. All these materials were buried underground within the ghetto.
Okay, so as we just saw, it was the biggest archive. There were other small archives in different ghettos, but the reason, as I said before, that we have so much information about the ghetto is because of this archive. The people who were writing were ordinary people. It wasn't only historians or only teachers for history or something like that. They basically went to different people and asked them to write about different topics on a daily basis. And that's why we have so much information. And it's, I want to relate here to the last sentence, is that what Immanuel Ringelblum believed that these are extraordinary times, they're extreme times. And because they're afraid that in the future, what people will know about what was going on with the Jews, not in the Warsaw Ghetto, but in general, they wanted to have the Jewish voice, the Jewish scripts, in order to make sure that other people around the world, specifically the Nazis or the Germans after the war, won't distort the memory. And the memory is something that we're continuing today on the basis of what we have here. So we heard also on this short film what they had. We have here newspapers and medical reports, and to the right we have a hidden Torah scroll. People wrote diaries on different topics. As again, we have the underground newspaper. To the left, the stories from Peretz Opolczynski, who was he gave out mail about that. We also have an interesting movie. But as you see, there was a lot of information. And I want to show you as I go on through the lecture how important this information is because of other information we have from Germans and from other people who were not Jewish, who wrote documents, who took pictures and so on. And as Ringelblum said, this is a picture with his son, the war changed the life of the Jews in cities of Poland very quickly. Oyneg Shabbos wanted to describe the events while they were warm because the day resembled dozens of years in previous periods. Now, in contradiction to what we just heard about the Jewish aspect, the Jewish voice, the Jewish writings, I want us to look at this picture over here. This is part of a bunch of pictures photographed by a person called, a Nazi called Hans Jost. He took these pictures in September 1941. It's very interesting, the date, and important to take in consideration the time when they were taken and what Jews knew at this point. And when I have a session about the Warsaw Ghetto with teachers, we have to make sure, I know that you're not educators, but I want you to think about like the background of what us educators look at, and also taken in consideration when you look at the pictures is in November 1940, the ghetto was closed. We're in September 1941. That means we're in between from when they were closed in the ghettos and to the point that they started sending them to Treblinka, not understanding in the beginning that they're going to Treblinka. What is Treblinka? So we're at a point in the middle that they're already quite a long time in the ghetto, but they don't know exactly what's waiting for them. Now, why do I want to look at this picture? A, because we have here the understanding of classes. We have this woman over here, she's dressed very well. You see the people around. We get kind of an atmosphere when we're looking at these kids. Now, these kids, they look like a gang. It's interesting to try and understand why they're sitting there, what are they doing there, and what I'm going to do with you at the moment is assumptions because we don't have subtitle to any of these pictures. But I'm emphasizing again, September 1941, photographed by Hans Jost, who's a German soldier. For many years, we didn't know why he was taking the pictures, or put it that way, we were told in the beginning that he had a day off for his birthday and for the funny, I mean, it's kind of cynical to say that, but for his fun, for his birthday, he went into the Warsaw Ghetto and took a bunch of pictures. Okay. Over time, when we found these pictures in other archives that opened in the Soviet Union, we understood that it wasn't for his fun, but we're not sure exactly why he took the pictures. But we have to remember that we're looking at people through a German lens. Now, these people over here, these kids over here, they have contact with a photographer. They're sitting here because in the background over here, there's a grocery store, and they're basically waiting for someone to come out with food and do whatever they have to do in order to survive. We name this picture the Snatchers, and there's a reason for that. Why are they sitting in the streets? Because maybe they don't have parents anymore. Maybe their families are broken. We know throughout different testimonies that many kids become the parents of their parents, so they're looking for food and they have to take care of the younger brothers and sisters and their parents. In some cases, when we're talking about the Warsaw Ghetto, some of the fathers were taken to work. So maybe they're kind of working. Maybe they're looking for a point that someone will come out with food and they'll snatch it. And the semantics here are very, very important because the way they see themselves is not thieves. And let's see what we have over here. Mary Berg wrote a diary. It was part of the Emanuel Ringelblum archive. And they speak about hunger, okay? November 1941, it is not easy to walk in the street with a parcel in one's hand. When a hungry person sees someone with a parcel that looks like food, he follows and at an opportune moment snatches it away, opens it quickly, and proceeds to satisfy his hunger. No, these are not thieves. They're just people crazed by hunger. Now, quite a few years ago when they opened the museum, I was asked to guide a group of survivors. I was terrified, specifically because I wasn't told they were survivors. It's just an SOS. They asked me to come and guide a group. Some guide was sick. I come to the group, they're already with the microphones. You know, in Israel, in the museum, with a group, you have a microphone and headphones. And so you never guide without knowing who you're guiding. And the supervisors there to come up to me, you have to go in quickly to the museum. They're late, there are other groups here. It was a whole big thing. And I said, fine, can I know who these people are? Because obviously you guide accordingly to the audience. He said, oh, the Holocaust survivors, but go in. Okay, my pulse was so high I couldn't just go in, and I was debating how to guide them because it was super difficult. I was thinking of my grandmother who passed away. It's going to be in 10 days the year. She died on the 22nd of Cheshvan. And when I started working at Yad Vashem, and I thought she would be proud of me, and I come up to her, you know, I'm going to guide Yad Vashem. I'll continue the family stories, the family heritage. And all she had to say is, you don't understand, you don't know anything, you weren't there. And with those sentences, I was going into the museum. When we came to the Warsaw Ghetto, standing in front of the picture I just showed you and others, one of the survivors tells me, how do you explain what hunger is? How do you guide groups who come to the museum? So I told him what I told him, basically that we're talking of people who are eating 184 calories a day. There were some who were eating more, the food was rationed, some managed to eat food because there was a lot of smuggling and black market. I said what I said, and then he looks at me and said, you don't understand what hunger is. Hunger is you think about it, you dream about it, you talk about it, and you snatch from other people. And the snatching, again, is how they see themselves under these circumstances. Snatching is a form of survival. And we see over here, Warsaw's June 2nd, 1942, I'm not a thief, I'm a snatcher. It's important for themselves to see themselves. And again, these are diaries that people wrote in order to hoping that other people will find this in the future. But it's also how they see themselves, but how they want other people to see themselves. They were crazed by hunger, and this was an issue of survival. We have here also a song. It's a bit difficult to read anything. Those of you who understand Yiddish, you can read Yiddish because the piece of paper was found in bad condition, but the song goes like this. Come get out to the street, in the street we shall die out. On the harsh, furious sidewalk, we will lay our children the pale. So again, all this together is information we get from the archive, besides the pictures that I'm talking about. And I'm going back to the same bunch of pictures taken by the same Hans Jost in September 1941. Again, we're in between when they came into the ghetto and starting to being liquidated to the camps. So we see over here the Star of David in the Warsaw Ghetto. They had to wear armbands and not the yellow star. Our assumption is that there's a space over here because this German soldier is coming and people are aware, are afraid, move aside, or he came in this big car. But look at this picture over here. We have this man taking his hat off. Also, he has the band. We see this woman over here with a stroller, baby stroller. I'm not going to go in length, but I think it's interesting to see how people relate to these pictures. And once I guided a group of 17-year-old kids, and they had a big question, very judgmental. I was very ambivalent. It took me a long time to think about what they said and to share what they said. But when they saw this, they asked the question, why are women having babies if the circumstances are hunger? People are dying by the thousands at this point when the pictures were taken. In brackets, there's some historians who say that even if the Jews wouldn't have been sent to the camps, they would have died anyway because of starvation, malnutrition. Many diseases were spread around because you see that there were so many people in the ghetto and they were so crammed together. The choice of becoming a parent was a big discussion, very, very critical. And we always have to be very, very careful when we see pictures and we assume assumptions. A, I don't know what's in this stroller, but B, you hear the testimonies of survivors and those who left information but didn't survive, is the willingness to become a parent, not understanding how long the war is going to be, how long they're going to be in the ghetto, how long these circumstances are going to continue. What we know today is not what they knew then when they were going through the stages of the Holocaust. But I want to relate to this man over here. Again, we're talking about September 41. Chaim Kaplan wrote a diary, was also found in the Oneg Shabat archive. And he's talking about respect. You know that when a German soldier went by, there was a decree that said you have to take off your hat as respect. There was a big question around that. On the one hand, the Jews in the ghetto sometimes didn't want to respect these people and didn't want to take off their hats because they didn't see the Nazis as people, which is again another discussion that Christopher Browning mentioned. We have to see them as people, and that's why this is so horrific. But they didn't want to respect, and we have respect. And we have over here another citation by Ante Zuckerman, who was the survivor, and he married at some point Tzivia Lubetkin. Together they came to Israel, and they were part of the founders of Kibbutz Lochmei HaGetaot, the Ghetto Fighters Kibbutz. And he wrote, "As for myself, I've never taken my hat off. The reason, I went about bareheaded, summer or winter, rain or shine, and I certainly was not the only one." The choice here not to respect, not to deal with the situation. If I don't take off my hat, I'm punished, or I have to do it because I told to, but I don't want to. And going back to the picture over here, I'm reminding you that these pictures are taken by Germans. That means that the way they see the Jews is the way they take the picture. And without having the diaries and the different documents from the Oyneg Shabbos archive, you don't have here the Jewish voice. You have here the German perspective. Even if you look at this picture and you're asking yourself, what's the big deal? It's a picture. You can see something going on this picture, other pictures, and additional pictures that we don't have in this presentation. What's the big deal? But it is, because when you look at a range of pictures, the Germans are trying to show a certain message about Jews. Sometimes they're taking pictures because they want to show how wonderful they are, and that's part of the propaganda they had to show the world something else, that they're not as bad as they're seen. But these are out of a lens of a German, and we always have to add the Jewish voice. And in this case, in the Warsaw Ghetto, we can do it because of the archives left behind. Another picture out of those Hans Jost pictures, he took more than 100 pictures, showing a lot hunger. Look carefully at this woman, how she's holding her bag. We spoke about the snatchers. We spoke about how they were crazed by the hunger in the Warsaw Ghetto. This woman over here, it's very difficult to try and guess her age because hunger changes features, changes the look. She's also dressed in torn clothes. She's basically on the ground because she can't stand anymore. And I'm saying again, at this point when the pictures were taken, we have thousands of people dying per month because of hunger and diseases, and obviously also psychological issues of people giving up. And this brings me, the hunger brings me into Dr. Yael Eaglstein. I don't know how many of you have heard of him, but he was a doctor also before the war. And he in February 1942, together with a group of close to 30 Jewish doctors, decided to research what happens to people when they're hungry, but not hungry like we are after Yom Kippur fast, but hungry, crazed by hunger, as we just saw over here. They decided to study the psychological and physiological effects of hunger in people in the ghetto. And what he wanted to do is to leave a scientific record to the extent of starvation in the ghetto, and also to record the extraordinary dedication of Jewish physicians working in the ghetto. There were a few hospitals in the ghetto, and they were trying to help. But what does it mean to help under these circumstances? You have so many people who are sick, so many people who are suffering. Everything is rationed. If food is rationed, then medicine is rationed. And obviously there was also smuggling in and out, where they were smuggling also medicine. But the choices they had to make: who do you treat? Who do you not treat? How do you treat? What do you do if you don't have medicine? Should you give to this patient or to that patient? And these dilemmas that they had to deal on a daily basis was very difficult, very tiring. And I think that in some cases, it was inevitable to help people because they had a lack of so many things. It's important and also interesting to learn about the fact that they had starvation studies in World War I, but they had been limited, and therefore this research was supposed to answer these questions. And by the way, they understood that people who are in these conditions of hunger, once they start eating again, you have to do it very, very, very gradually. And we know that at liberation, when the Jews were liberated by the Americans, by the French, by the Russians, one of the things that happened was that they were overfed. On the one hand, the rescuers wanted to give as much as they could. The victims tried to eat as much as they could because they didn't see these amounts of food. But if they would have known what Eaglstein knew, that you have to do it gradually, then things were a bit different, because we know that many survivors, or many Jews who survived the war and came to the day of liberation, died because they overate in the first few days after liberation. So Yael Eaglstein was sent to Treblinka in 1943. They were no different from the other Jews in the ghettos because he was a doctor. There were many other doctors and professors who were sent to their death or died because of the difficult circumstances. And shortly after the liquidation of the ghetto in 1943, they smuggled out the manuscript, and Professor Witold Orlowski, and you have his picture over here, he managed to publish it. This is the research, and one of the surviving researchers, Dr. Emil Appelbaum, he reclaimed the typescript from its hiding and published it through the American Joint Distribution Committee later on. Okay, so we spoke about hunger, we spoke about archive, and we spoke about research about the hunger. And I have here another set of pictures, also taken by a German called Willy George. They were taken just a few months before Hans Jost. We said Hans Jost took the pictures September 41, These pictures were taken in June 1941, just a few months before. In terms of weather, we're talking about summer and towards winter. And also here, again, the same picture, the same place. We're talking about Warsaw Ghetto. We're talking about the same people, cramped people, hungry people, people who some of their family members died, some of their family members are sick. We're talking about the same people that in many cases children became the parents of the parents. And we see here something else. We see here a different attitude. We see here people smiling. We have this bunch of pictures and this bunch of pictures. I think it doesn't look like the same ghetto. It doesn't look like the same circumstances. Okay, we're talking about a difference of a few months. Again, these pictures are taken through the lens of a German. Willie George was a professional photographer. During the war, he was a radio technician. He was positioned just outside of the Warsaw Ghetto that was surrounded by a wall. And he asked his officer to come into the ghetto. He got permission to take pictures. He took 4 films, but he was caught by a different officer in the ghetto. His camera was confiscated, but he managed to keep the films, and he kept them and developed them after the war. And here we have them. So also here, in order to understand exactly what was going on, we need the Jewish voice that we'll get through the Jewish documents. But I think that these pictures show kind of an empathy of Willie George in comparison to Hans Just, because the atmosphere and the faces look a bit different. They're giving us a different message. But again, we're talking out of the eyes of German photographers. Gela Seksztajn was also in the Warsaw Ghetto, was born in 1907 in Warsaw. She was an artist painter. She got her education in Krakow. She was a member of the Association of the Jewish Artists, the Jewish Society of Fine Arts, and she painted numerous portraits of Jewish figures in Warsaw. And in 1938, she married Yael Eaglstein. 2 years later, they had their daughter. We're talking about 1940, already in the ghetto. And they were part of people who collected things for Emanuel Ringelblum. I'm reminding you that because he didn't go only to historians, then he had a vast variety of people. He had historians, he had teachers, he had painters, he had kids. You will see at the end a school curriculum. And they see things a bit differently. I want to share with you also another short movie about their message to the world, to the Jewish world, to the world, and why they found it important to keep information in the Warsaw, in the Oyneg Shabat archive. So let's see what she and her husband say, and then we'll continue to the next part.
In September 1939, Nazi Germany conquered Poland. 1 month later, historian Emanuel Ringelblum began chronicling the Jews of Warsaw and the surrounding areas under Nazi control. Once the Jews were forced into the Warsaw Ghetto, Ringelblum decided to found the clandestine Oyneg Shabbos archive. He assembled a group of documenters of different backgrounds with the intention of chronicling the events as they transpired at all levels of Jewish society. The archive personnel conducted studies, documented events, and collected writings of the ghetto prisoners. They collected testimony and documents, newspapers, diaries, photographs, and artworks. With the beginning of the Great Deportation of Warsaw Jewry to the Treblinka extermination camp, and the archive members themselves seeking shelter, they decided that the archive was to be buried, despite the risks involved, with the hope that it would one day be retrieved and serve as testament to the murder of Polish Jewry. Among those entrusted with this task were 2 educators, Yael Eaglstein and his wife, painter Gela Seksztajn. Shortly before burying the archives, they added their own wills, which are presented here.
It may be that I do not deserve to be remembered, only perhaps for the courage to help with the Oyneg Shabbos group, to be the one most exposed to danger for my having hidden the entire material. To pay with my own head would have been a trifle, but I risk the head of my beloved wife, Gela Seksztajn, and of my jewel, my little daughter, Margalit.
On November 4th, 1940, I gave birth to my daughter. She is my happiness and pride. She is a fine child, talented and pretty. This is my sorrow and pain. If I survive, it will be because of and for my beloved daughter.
I want my wife to be remembered, Gela Seksztajn, talented artist-painter, whose numerous works could not be exhibited, could not appear in the bright light.
Work of 10 years, put together, torn up and resumed. I endeavored to exhibit my pictures, particularly the exhibition Portraits of a Jewish Child. I bequeath my works to the Jewish Museum, which will be established in the future in order to recreate pre-war Jewish culture life up to the year 1939. And study the terrible tragedy of the Jewish community in Poland during the war.
I know we shall not last. It is not possible to live through, to survive such horrible murders, such massacres. This is why I write this, my will, my testament.
I seek no praise. I merely wish that some trace remain of my name and the name of my daughter, the talented little girl Margalit Lichtenstein.
At present, together with me, both of us get ready to meet and receive death.
What can I say and ask at this moment? Poised on the border between life and death, more certain that I won't live than that I shall, I wish to take leave of my friends and works.
Jews shall not be wiped out. We, the Jews of Poland, of Czechia, of Slovakia, of Lithuania, of Latvia, we are the redeemers for the entire people of Israel and all other lands. I have thrown myself with flaming enthusiasm into the work of collecting material for the archive. I have been charged with the role of guardian of the access gate. I hid the material. Only I knew.
Now I am come. I must perish, but I have done my share. I am trying to preserve some trace of my works. Farewell, friends and comrades. Farewell, Jewish people. Don't allow such ruin to recur.
What we see here from Gela Seksztajn is that they're writing a will. We have to make sure that things like this don't reoccur again. And the fact that they're writing a will and they're writing things close to their death, these are the voices that we will not see in the German pictures, even though we're relying on them to kind of feel a bit what was going on there, but to feel a bit more and understand the depth of the pain and the depth of understanding that it's the end, or that the Jewish world is coming to an end, is only through what the Jews wrote during the Holocaust, and the last words that we heard from Gela Seksztajn and Yael Eaglstein. And I think that we can end with what we have here written on the screen by Untitled Chapter. It must all be recorded with not a single fact omitted. When the time comes, as it surely will, let the world read and know what the murders have done. Now, this is the background over here, is a curriculum in one of the schools in the Warsaw Ghetto. You know, until some point there were schools officially. At some point they had to be secret. And we have here remains of a curriculum. You can see here Yom Rishon, Sunday, they learned Hebrew, math, and Polish. The same thing we see here on Thursday. There's another day here with, I think it's Ivrit, Hebrew, art, and Zimra, singing. And you have here the picture of Shabat. In the end of the day, although all the difficult circumstances that we mentioned, that we know about, people were struggling to stay alive, and that's what we have. There existed a school system, and you see here the curriculum, and there were newspapers and all kinds of cultural events. Even though the circumstances were extreme, were difficult, were painful, many of them wanted to continue. We know that the end of the story of the Warsaw Ghetto was in April 1943, when the uprising began and ended in May 1943. And all we have remains is a few survivors, which are less and less with us, but what we have here from the Oyneg Shabbos archive. So thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, and this is the time.
Okay, we did have anybody can write questions in the chat. There were one or two questions that we had previously, so I will give one of them to you now. Noreen Plen, she said, she shared with us that her mom and her sister escaped in January of 1943 from the Warsaw Ghetto with the help of the Joint. And so her question is, can you explain how people communicated with people in the ghetto? How did that happen?
That's a good question. First of all, the Warsaw Ghetto wasn't completely isolated. It was positioned in the city of Warsaw, in the center. It wasn't completely isolated in comparison. We make a lot of comparisons with the Lodz Ghetto because it was the second largest ghetto, and that was completely isolated. You couldn't go in, you couldn't go out, everything was in the ghetto. So first of all, it wasn't isolated. A tram was going through, information was going through, and there was connections with the outer world. You saw that also the manuscript of Dr. Milikovsky, the manuscript of their research was smuggled out. So there was information going in and out the whole time. Why didn't they rescue everyone? Or why didn't everybody try to connect? It wasn't possible. But there was connection with the outer world in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Okay, thank you. It looks like we have a few questions here about finding the archive. When did they find it? How did they know where to look? The difficulties?
So there were two people who survived, who knew where they were buried. They found them in two parts, in 1946 and 1950. There's a third part that until today, no one knows where it is. I don't know if it's because Warsaw was completely ruined, completely bombed. But in 1946 and 1950, they found the two big parts of the archive. And there were two people who survived, who knew where they were buried, where they buried the archive.
Okay.
By the way, one of the women who wrote for the archive was Rachel Oyarbach. She wrote about the soup kitchens. She at some point smuggled out of the ghetto, and she was part of the committee who went over the different documents. And at some point, she came to Israel and she worked at Yad Vashem.
Okay. We have here this is about the space of the ghetto itself. And the question is, how were those locations chosen within the city, and who was living there before? How was the space chosen and who was living there before, and then how did that proceed?
Area, they chose a bit rundown areas. There were local Polish people who were living in that area and Jews. The Polish people obviously had to leave, but we know that not only those Polish people, but many others went into homes of Jews who were sent to ghettos and camps. So it was chosen because it was a rundown area on the one hand, but also people who were living there who were not Jewish were sent out of the area and went to live in other housing, in some cases in Jewish homes.
Okay. So we have,
How many ghettos are in Europe? I see that. There are about 1,000 ghettos. Very important to emphasize, there were no ghettos in the western part of Europe. Holland, Germany, France, there were no ghettos. They didn't have an easy life. I'm not coming to say because they didn't have a ghetto, then their life was wonderful and they had enough of everything. No, they had to live in certain areas. They had a curfew at night. They also had a lack of food, a lack of many things. They also had a lack of information on what was going in the East. But the 1,000 ghettos were basically in central and eastern part of Europe, and there were just over 1,000. How did schools run in the ghetto?
Okay, and by the way, as long as you're talking about somebody did ask about Terezin. What was the definition there? Camp, ghetto, and so you may as well, and you're on the same topic. So
first of all, how did they have schools? Private people or communities, like in certain areas, they just decided to create groups of kids and teach them. By the way, interesting to read that they had arguments about what to teach them. For example, if they should teach Latin or not. That was part of the misunderstanding or lack of information or internalizing what was going on. They thought that there would be an end to this in life after, which there was, but after many Jews were killed. So they were done privately. A few people who came together or a school system that existed outside somehow did it inside. And about Theresienstadt, which is totally different from Warsaw, it was 60 kilometers north of Prague in the Czech Republic. It was kind of in between a ghetto and a camp, because in most ghettos, families lived together, and here the men and the women weren't living together. The circumstances were a bit different. It was they used the ghetto as an example for to show the world that the situation in the ghettos aren't as bad as they seem to be. It was used for propaganda purposes. It was an in-between station between homes and going to the camps. My great-grandfather and great-grandmother also went, they were originally from Germany. They went through Theresienstadt before they were sent to Auschwitz, but it's completely a different story. And yes, the definition is kind of in between a ghetto and a camp. What is this?
Sorry about that. Yeah, no, I think we have time for, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, so we'll do that. Other than the uprising, was the Warsaw Ghetto unique from other ghettos in its range of cultural offerings before the Great Deportations? And if so, was this due to its 400,000 size population?
A lot was done in the ghetto also because there were many people there. So you have different people who have the strength to do, to create these different educational units. It could be a school, it can be an opera or anything like that. It happened also in other ghettos. It's just we have a lot of information and knowledge about the ghetto because of archives. So if things were going on and they were written, we know about them because of the archive. But in the Lodz Ghetto, again, I'm going back to the Lodz Ghetto, they had a chronicle there that was written. Do we have as much information as the archive? No, we don't. But things were written, diaries and different documents were written in other ghettos, but not as much as we had in the archive that was managed by Emanuel Engelblum.
Okay, so yeah, Al, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone for joining today. We are happy to have you back, and everybody make sure that you look for the email again on Tuesday, and so you can all come back next Thursday. We apologize for technical difficulties. We are doing our best from our end, and just keep in mind during Corona, people are working from their homes, and so we have to also work with that. So we appreciate your patience in the technical department. We're going to do our best to make sure everything runs as smooth as possible for next time, and we are looking forward to seeing you all again. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.